when the Modi regime came into power, it became complicit in the acts of this Hindutva nationalist movement. The democratic potential of the Indian people just completely finished by the power of money and wealth. So the regime in power has a very close nexus with Indian big business. You have an optimism of the spirit, but the ground reality makes you very pessimistic. Democracy is governance in accordance with the will of the people. The power of money and wealth has destroyed the democratic potential of the Indian people. The entire Indian left should have come together in the form of a united front. The form is Leninist, the content of your politics is not Leninist actually. Because after all, you are trying to create a casteless, anti-patriarchal and classless society. If that is the objective, then you need to bring in Shudra and Dalits into the leadership of the party. You need to bring in more and more women also.
Hello. Today we have with us Bernardo Di Mello, author and journalist. He was deputy editor with the Economic and Political Weekly and he has written extensively on India's revolutionary movements. He is the author of India After Naxalbari, an Unfinished History. He will be talking on Indian polity, fascism and revolutionary movements. Sir, welcome to this show. The last 5 years, according to many academicians, activists, has changed India like never before. See, what do you think has been the greatest change that India has undergone, Indian polity has undergone in this last 5 years of Modi regime?
Well, in my opinion, India has been, before Modi came to power, so India has been what I have called a rotten liberal political democracy. And I have elaborated on this in terms of Barrington Moore Jr.'s conception of liberal political democracy and so on. I need not get into that, but at the heart of liberal political democracy is actually electoral competition, where two or more political parties compete for office through a process of elections and so on. This electoral process also actually in recent years, when I say recent years, this is over the last 25 years actually, it has come under the influence of money and wealth actually. So it may just be the case that BJP's money beats Congress's money, and in another election it may just be that Congress's money beats BJP's money. It's really the democratic potential of the Indian people just completely finished by the power of money and wealth, and that I think, apart from other characteristics of rotten liberal political democracy, is what I'm talking about. So Modi didn't bring in rotten political liberal political democracy. But after Modi, certainly there have been significant changes. And would you like me to talk about some of this? Well, actually, much of this is not because of Modi. It so happens that Modi is, has been the face of both the party and the government over the last 5 years. What is important to understand here is that, you have what I call a fascist mass movement actually. And this mass movement came to the fore, in terms of the Ayodhya and the Babri Masjid demolition campaign that was launched by the BJP and the Sangh Parivar actually. This, so when you say a fascist mass movement, you know, it basically is a kind of a strong arm, repressive kind of movement which suppresses its necessary enemies. You know, so this was already in place before the Modi regime came into power and so on. Now, what happened is that when the Modi regime came into power, it not only actually encouraged but became complicit in the acts of this Hindutva nationalist movement actually, and including its illegal acts like you know, lynching and all these things, you know. So if you ask me actually where Modi made the changes that came in with Modi, I would say number one is that Modi actually came to meet the criteria or what I would say the preferred kind of characteristics of the classic fascist leader, a classic fascist leader. And this comes out actually in his style of leadership also. It is really what you might call an authoritarian democratic way of functioning. When I say autocratic democratic, it seems I am contradicting myself, but let me explain this actually. What I mean here is that Modi claims and tries very hard to establish what I may call a spiritual kind of rapport with the people. For instance, his Man Ki Baat, you know, his Man Ki Baat over these last couple of years, you know. So a kind of a spiritual union with his you know. But this is in the context, you see, you have to remember that, you know, over decades now, the Sangh Parivar has sort of inculcated and socialized whole generations of young people, you know, in what may be called Hindu Sanskriti, Hindu Sanskriti, and the culture of Hindutva and so on. So Modi comes to believe that this Hindu Sanskriti, this Hindutva type of politics enjoys a kind of widespread support and legitimacy. So whatever he does is predicated upon the fact that he believes that he enjoys a great degree of legitimacy because of the earlier socialization that has taken place in terms of Hindu Sanskriti and Hindutva, you know, cultural motifs and other things, you know. So this is the difference, and it reflects in terms of leadership, you know, and so on. This is one aspect of it. The other aspect of actually the changes, I would say, is this nexus with big business. So the regime in power has a very close nexus with Indian big business, to the extent also that what may be called parvenu businessmen like Adani and so on. When Modi was the chief minister in Gujarat, actually, he brought to the fore and preferred certain parvenu businessmen, and these have, in a historically unprecedented manner, achieved an accumulation of wealth and attained the status of big business in record time and so on. And this is also an aspect of the leadership of Modi. So this very close nexus with big business and the promotion of parvenu businessmen, this I would say is also a distinctive characteristic of it. The third one is, of course, which I mentioned earlier, is the complicity between the regime and the Hindutwadi nationalist movement. This is the third. The fourth one, and this is also in line with the RSS ideology, is you set up some necessary enemies and you deal with those necessary enemies through the employment or the use of terror. These are distinctive aspects of the politics that has come into play during the.
So you were telling about the rotten liberal democracy of India for the last 25 years. Last 25 years also marks the beginning of neoliberal regime in India. So do you think that this democracy, the liberalism, is incongruent with what we may call as liberalism?
See, basically, if you look at, the common understanding that people have of democracy, democracy is governance in accordance with the will of the people. That's what commonly we understand. If you ask someone in the street, not an intellectual, if you ask somebody in the street, this is what that person will have in mind, that governance in accordance with the will of the people. Now, inherently, capitalism is incompatible with such a view of democracy. By its very nature and function, capitalism is incompatible with such a view of democracy, actually. Capitalism comes inherently in all capitalist societies. Capitalism comes into contradiction with democracy in this sense of its meaning, actually. So one might say that capitalism lives with it. It finds an accommodation with liberal political democracy because it's easier for capitalism for the political management of capitalism. Liberal political democracy is the easiest and the smoothest way to manage the system. It's difficult to manage the system through a fascist mode of functioning. There are much more conflicts and so on which are generated, which you have to manage. So liberal political democracy, while it is incompatible with capitalism, if you have a meaning of liberal political democracy as governance according to the will of the people, at the same time, capitalism learns how to manage liberal political democracy in a way where there is less conflict, less political conflict created in the process of that management.
But generally, see, you were telling about this rotten system of liberal democracy in India, and it started in 25 years. That is what you have explained.
It got worse.
It got worse. So, what does it mean? The neoliberal regime also started in 1991. So, do you think that this neoliberal regime has made this system more rotten?
See, when you talk of liberal political democracy, there are various characteristics of liberal political democracy. For instance, the number one characteristic is actually universal franchise, universal adult franchise. Now, the management of universal adult franchise, as I mentioned, actually, the power of money and wealth has destroyed the democratic potential of the Indian people, and that is the core aspect of rotten liberal political democracy. But if you look at liberal political democracy in terms of its other components, there are other components of liberal political democracy. For instance, actually, an important component of liberal political democracy is civilian management of the civilian control over the armed forces. So, civilian political control over the armed forces, actually. But here, the democracy has become that rotten, and this didn't happen in Modi's time. This happened much before, actually, in the last 25 years. For instance, actually, I'll just give you an example. You know, I remember P. Chidambaram, at that time he was Home Minister, I think, or Finance Minister, I don't remember. But he gave the K. Subramaniam Memorial Lecture in Delhi. And I think a journalist asked him about the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And because there was this talk about, you know, amending or scrapping the armed forces. So he said, this is not politically feasible, you can't do it. So the journalist questioned him further, and he said, well, it won't go down well with the army. Now this is very significant actually, and this is a view across the political spectrum. It's not merely Congress or BJP holding such a view, across the political spectrum, you know. So, which means actually our democracy has become so rotten that actually the Armed Forces Special Powers Act cannot be amended.
Just because of the fact that it will not go.
That's because the army opposes it actually. This is very significant. I can go on and on in terms of the characteristics of political democracy, but you see the line of thinking that I am, you know, getting at.
But this is true with all democracies, all kinds of democracies. Now, if you take United States of America or Brazil, these people are also electing these kinds of leaders, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi here. So is this ample proof that the kind of democracies that is being practiced in these capitalist countries won't work or will get rotten during the period of time?
Because well, to an extent actually it also it also depends on the extent to which actually progressive forces resist. So progressive forces come into the picture and resist the power of money and wealth. You know, so you know the opposition to rotten liberal political democracy. It also depends on that. You cannot completely rule that out. There may be a political force that comes on the picture today or tomorrow in India, which may want to reform liberal political democracy to remove some of these, you know, rotten characteristics, so to say.
So now dissent is being muscled, the security apparatus of the state is getting strengthened, and even army chief is commenting on the political policies that has to be taken in Kashmir or in other insurgent areas, other insurgent areas. This marks a new phase in Indian democracy. So how do you see that the future of Indian democracy? Because army chief is making statements and the security apparatus of the state is getting strengthened, there is no dissent. Everywhere there seems to be a consensus with regard to nationalism or developmental policies, etc.
No, it's reached a stage, it's atrocious actually. If you, the present army chief, I recall in some interview, he said that we have the capacity to fight a 2.5 front war. By 2.5 he meant Pakistan, China and internal opposition, which means, you know, the internal opposition in Kashmir or the northeast and, you know, the Maoists and, you know, all that. Now, he has no business to talk like this actually. It's the political leadership which decides these things in a liberal political democracy. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's reached a stage.
You were telling earlier that India is a semi-fascist state, and the reason being given is that the opposition are not liquidated or banned. So, but at the same time, don't you think that this opposition, mainstream opposition parties are being appropriated by the narratives of Hindutva, or because even the main opposition party is soft-pedaling on Hindutva. When it comes to developmental policies, everybody seems to be in a consensus position, because we know that P. Chidambaram is a great votary of neoliberalism. He may come back to power, and their position on Kashmir, their position on other issues are also seems to be they are all on the same page, I think. So Indian opposition, even if though there is a political opposition here in India, but they are being appropriated by the mainstream narratives of Hindutva. Is it not like that?
Well, actually, you know, if you ask me, broadly speaking, actually, on economic policy, there wouldn't be much difference between BJP and Congress as far as both would be, you know, in tune with neoliberal economic policies and so on. But I don't know about other, you know, aspects of public policy, whether they would be on the same frequency or not, and so on. Maybe to a degree one can I could agree with you. For instance, I mean, you know, Congress did to an extent actually implement the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. The BJP has not shown the same enthusiasm in doing that actually, and allocations for it, and even payments of dues and so on. There's a lot of you know, and so on. So there is a matter of degree in these things, you know. I think Congress to an extent actually they did amend the Land Acquisition Act and so on, you know, the 1894 Act, and they brought in a new act and so on, which Indian big business was not very happy with the new act and so on. But the BJP, you know, found it politically difficult to amend the new act and so on, in line with the needs of big business and so on. So to a degree there are differences, you know, in public policy and so on. I wouldn't completely equate, you know, the two main political parties as regards public policy.
Okay. Now coming back to this revolutionary movements, you have classified the Naxalite movement into three phases. See, from 1968 to 2000, this period you have classified into three. What has been the major difference in their strategy during these phases? How did you distinguish between these three phases generally?
It's true actually that both in Naxalbari and in Srikakulam, there were ongoing peasant organizations. The CPM in both cases had ongoing peasant organizations, and but you know, when you sort of are contemplating the launch of armed struggle, it requires a whole different approach over a significant period of time, you know, in preparing your mass base for the launch of armed struggle actually. I think sadly, this was not done in both cases. In Naxalbari, you know, the movement was simply not even in a position to resist the armed police of the West Bengal government itself, let alone the central paramilitary forces, but even the West Bengal armed police, the Eastern Frontier Rifles and so on, they were not able to actually, you know, resist. So there was, the peasantry was not prepared. There's a lot of hard underground work that is required before the launch of armed struggle. And
that was not done during the Naxalite period.
This is a classic. This is in Vietnam, in China. There's a lot of hard background underground work that is done before the launch of armed struggle. This was simply not the case, and this is a major flaw actually. In Srikakulam, the situation was much better than in Naxalbari. In fact, in Srikakulam, they had armed squads in place. They had armed squads in place, which they didn't have in Naxalbari actually. But even in Srikakulam, that hard underground work before the launch of armed struggle, this, in other words, in Hindi, in Hindustani, you would say jaldi bazi ki, but this was the first phase, and the first phase, the movement faced defeat, faced defeat. Heroic, courageous, sacrificing, but they faced defeat because of certain flaws actually. And in the second phase actually, at least some of the parties actually, the main parties in Andhra Pradesh, the People's War, which was formed in 1980, April 1980, the CPI-ML PW, that is People's War Party, and in Bihar, for instance, the CPI-ML Party Unity and the Maoist Communist Center and so on. They, after the emergency actually, they began to focus on mass mobilization. Even the CPI-ML Liberation also in Bihar, they began to focus on mass mobilization of the peasantry. Of course, alongside the mass mobilization, there were the armed squads in defense. So the armed squads were in defense. And gradually on this basis, and anticipating counterinsurgency, the step up of counterinsurgency later on, they also took certain measures. For instance, PW took the measure, they crossed the Godavari river very early in 1980 itself. They crossed the Godavari river and went into what was then the Chandrapur district of Maharashtra. That time Gadchiroli and Chandrapur, they were one district. It was Gadchiroli was a block of Chandrapur district. It was a big district. And then further, another armed group went into what was then southern Madhya Pradesh, the Bastar region of Madhya Pradesh and so on. So in guerrilla parlance, they were establishing a rear. So, if in northern Telangana they face a severe counterinsurgency, they always have a rear where the forces can go over to the other side and into the rear and so on. This is required in guerrilla warfare. You need a wide terrain to operate and so on. So they were taking these measures while they were focusing on mass mobilization, they were taking these measures and so on. So in other words, actually, there was a kind of a hard background, underground work being undertaken and so on. So they learned certain lessons from the failure of stage 1, so that is stage 2. But stage 2 reaches a point where the counterinsurgency gets centralized in the Union Home Ministry. The central paramilitary forces are unleashed, including actually the Indo-Tibetan border police and the BSF and all these forces and so on. So the counterinsurgency goes full-fledged, and so on. And in that context, actually, they then form a guerrilla army. So the armed squads, there's a certain expansion in armed activity and so on, ultimately leading to the formation of platoons and then, a battalion and then a guerrilla army, which gets established, I think, sometime in 2000. I think 2000, the People's Guerrilla Army comes into place and so on. So this is phase 2, a mass mobilization phase, at the same time anticipating counterinsurgency and, and ultimately leading to the formation of a People's Guerrilla Army,
So what happened in the third phase?
The third phase is different because actually, the neoliberal strategy of India takes a certain leap. That leap actually is the opening up of infrastructure, so including power plants and all these things, mining, and other activity to the private sector, where actually memorandums of understanding are entered into with big businesses, including multinationals and so on. And much of this mineral wealth is located in the tribal areas in central and eastern India and so on and so forth, So Odisha and Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and so on. So what I had mentioned earlier, I think in terms of, not now, but in the talk I just gave, the emergence of financial aristocracy within big business, a financial aristocracy in the sense that it accumulates wealth more by usurping the wealth of others, including the tribal resource bases, state wealth to privatizations and all this thing and so on and so forth. So a financial aristocracy comes into place, and there's been a kind of a huge increase in the wealth and power and incomes of Indian big business and so on, and a close nexus between Indian big business and the Indian state and so on. So in this context of all the launch of these private infrastructural projects and mining projects and so on, many of these in the areas where the Maoists were active and so on, gives rise to another kind of resistance, a counterinsurgency as well as a response to that counterinsurgency. So it's a qualitatively different phase, the third phase, which begins, in my view, after the merger of PW. I don't call it PWG. It's not a group, it's a party actually. So I don't use the term PWG. Okay. It's not a group, it's a party. So it was a party, but these two, so PW and MCC, Maoist Communist Center of India, they merged to form CPI Maoist. This actually leads to widening the terrain of guerrilla warfare actually. It widens the terrain, and there's a complete coordination in over the whole terrain and so on. MCC also had a guerrilla army. PW had a guerrilla army. The two guerrilla armies merged to form the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army. So, actually the whole insurgency reached a qualitatively different and higher level with this merger actually. And in the context of the financial aristocracy and the accumulation by dispossession and so on that was going on in this is a qualitatively different phase of the Maoist movement, in my view.
But this is as a fact that now the security system gets strengthened, the surveillance system is omnipotent, everywhere there is surveillance. And what do you think, how much significant is the guerrilla warfare in these times?
See, the thing that, the propounders of this strategy, and where this strategy was practiced and was relatively successful, is Ho Chi Minh and General Giap in Vietnam, and Mao Zedong and Lin Biao and others in China actually. Now here, it was a successful combination of mass mobilization and guerrilla warfare. A combination. It is a kind of symbiosis of mass mobilization and guerrilla warfare. I think the counterinsurgency in India has prevented this from happening as far as the Maoist movement is concerned. So the other aspect of it is that a guerrilla army cannot grow or last for very long unless there are base areas that are created. Base areas. Base areas are a significant terrain of land where the movement gains sovereignty over. So not the Indian state, but the movement gains sovereignty over and manages in that area, it manages a new democratic state. Okay. So that is where actually the guerrilla army finds the best rear possible for it, you know. And it is only when base areas are created that your guerrilla army can grow and sustain itself over a longer period. But in India, the movement has not been able to create base areas, and this is its principal weakness.
So you are suggesting that the Indian state prevented it from having this?
They have not, so far they have been successful in not allowing this to happen.
See, one thing that is often said about Indian communist movement is that the caste is the stumbling block in front of the communist movement in reaching out to the masses. So how far does the Maoist movement able to address the caste issue of Indian society?
Well, in the first phase of the movement, if there was any success on this score, I think with my limited knowledge, of course, it was in Bhojpur. In Bhojpur, actually, under the leadership of Subroto Datta, you know, the party, it had a significant success in handling the caste question. I'll not go into details, but I think, you know, basically, actually, you know, you have middle class persons, committed middle class persons becoming revolutionaries, but they come from certain social backgrounds. They come from educated, highly educated people and so on, but they come from upper caste social backgrounds and so on. And even in the medium term, we are not able to completely overcome that social background, you know. And so not only that, in a medium term, you know, you are not able to develop a leadership where actually, you know, Shudra and Ati Shudra, so Dalit and Shudra caste also come in and become part of the leadership within the movement. This has taken an inordinately long time in happening actually. Even today, actually, there is a great need actually for Dalit and Shudra castes to ultimately become part of the senior leadership of the party, to be part and parcel of the senior leadership. When I say senior leadership, I mean central committee level people, you know, in the party and so on. The intention is there, but it has not happened to the extent that it should have happened by now actually, 50 years gone by and so on. A similar thing holds with respect to women. I think there is a dire need for more women to also become part of the senior leadership of the party, which means the central committee and that level and so on, you know, because after all, you know, you are trying to create a casteless, anti-patriarchal and classless society. And if that is the objective, then you need to bring in, you know, Shudra and Dalit into the leadership of the party. You need to bring in more and more women also to make them part of the leadership of the party and so on. I think the intention is there, but it has not happened to the extent that probably the leadership itself wanted it to happen. Why? I don't know actually.
So you have written a lot about revolutionary movements. What do you think is the future of the Indians' mainstream left parties?
Well, if you ask me, frankly, no, I wouldn't say, you know, I mean, I don't look at this phenomenon in terms of, you know, the electoral cycles and so on. We need to look at things over a longer period and so on. If you ask me, and I'm not very hopeful also, you know. I'll tell you why actually. See, the mainstream left, and when I say the mainstream left, the classic example is CPIM, so CPM, you see. In terms of forms and structures, the form and the structure, the organization and so on, it is Leninist. So you have Leninist forms and structures, but the content is not Leninist, you know. This is the whole problem. The form is Leninist, the content of your politics is not Leninist actually. And the content of the politics, what is it? If you ask me, at the core of it is actually, see, when you say Leninist, it means you have a clear strategy to win the class struggle, to win the class struggle. That means to gain state power in the first place and then transform the economic, socio-economic and political institutions of the society in line with socialism. So, you know, that is Leninist politics. You win the class struggle. I don't see any of these parties in terms of their programs or strategies thinking on these lines. That is why I say the content of their politics is not Leninist. It's not Lenin. The forms are Leninist, but the content is not. What is the content actually? The content is managing the class struggle. Managing the class struggle. So you get incorporated into the system where if you have Center for Indian Trade Unions, you know, and so on, you know, it's basically running the unions, engaging in collective bargaining, you know, making deals with management and so on and so forth, you know. But the larger goal of winning the class struggle, no, it's not that. So basically you get involved in the management of the capitalist system when you engage in this kind of politics. So it's not Leninist, it's not Leninist.
So you are suggesting that rather than exacerbating this process of class war, they are managing class war?
Not war, I wouldn't say war at all, but you know, it's a way of managing the class struggle actually. So the class struggle just goes on, and you have trade unions and so on, you know, who enter into deals with management through a process of collective bargaining. And you know, what I mean is that, you know, it's thoroughly sort of incorporated into the establishment itself. It is in opposition to an extent actually, it is in opposition, but in a fundamental sense it's not Leninist. It's managing the system, managing the class struggle actually, so to say. I can't find a better word for management. I'm using the term but surely if I think it out, I'll find a better word which will reflect what I'm really thinking. I'm not able to find another word for managing the class struggle, but that's what they do. So they are not Leninist. Form is Leninist, content is not Leninist.
So now only 2 months are left for the general elections to happen. So do you think that it will in a way save Indian democracy even if it is rotten?
Well, actually, if you have to really defeat the BJP, I think, and this should have been done 5 years ago, the left, the Indian left as a whole should have come together in the form of a united front.
All left parties.
All left parties. Not only the parliamentary parties, the entire Indian left should have come together in the form of a united front. So certain activities, they have a common program. I don't mean they, you know, they merge or anything. It's a front, it's a united front. They come together, and then this united front tries to rope in the liberal bourgeois democratic parties, the liberal bourgeois parties. Okay, I'm not saying the right-wing bourgeois parties, the liberal bourgeois parties, to form a popular front, See, this remains a non-exercise. It's not been done at all. This is the classic mode of how actually Dimitrov then, implementing Stalin's policies in the mid 1930s or after, during that time, to take on the fascist threat. And I think in India it's as serious as that. And the left should have done this. The left should have, after forming a united front, made all efforts to bring together the liberal political democratic parties and form a larger popular front and so on to take on the Modi regime. But none of this is even on the horizon today. So you have an optimism of the spirit, but on the ground, the ground reality makes you very pessimistic actually. That's how I feel. I mean, I may be optimistic in terms of, the spirit of, the left project and all these kind of things, but the ground reality
is something else.
Is something else.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.